For over 1,000 years, historians told one story about where the Punjabi people came from. Warrior tribes sweeping down from Central Asia, ancient invaders mixing with local farmers. A single simple bloodline stretching back to the plains of the Indus. But in the last few years, something happened that no textbook saw coming. Scientists extracted DNA from skeletons buried more than 4,000 years ago. Bones from the lost cities of the Indus Valley, bones from the steppes of Central Asia, and bones from villages scattered across modern Punjab. And when they lined up the genetic code side by side, the story fell apart. The real origin of the Punjabi people is stranger, older, and far more complicated than anyone believed. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly where that DNA really came from, and why it took scientists 1,000 years to figure it out. Here is what we are going to uncover today. First, the civilization that vanished from Punjab almost 4,000 years ago, and the genetic fingerprint it left behind. Second, the mysterious wave of outsiders who arrived after that collapse, people whose DNA changed the region forever. And third, the exact genetic formula that makes Punjabi ancestry different from every other group in South Asia, according to the newest ancient DNA studies. If you have Punjabi ancestry, or your family traces back anywhere near the Indus River, stay until the end, because there's a detail in this story that scientists only confirmed recently, and it changes how we should think about identity in this entire region. To understand where Punjabi DNA really comes from, we have to go back further than most people expect. Not 1,000 years, not 2,000 years, but almost 5,000 years, to one of the most advanced civilizations the ancient world ever produced. Long before Rome, before Greece rose to power, before the pyramids of Giza were even finished, a civilization was thriving along the banks of the Indus River and its tributaries, rivers that cut straight through what is now Punjab. Archaeologists call it the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes the Harappan Civilization, named after the city of Harappa, one of its largest urban centers. This was not a small tribal settlement. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization covered more territory than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities had underground drainage systems more advanced than anything Europe would build for another 3,000 years. It had standardized weights, planned street grids, and a writing system that, to this day, no one has fully deciphered. Millions of people once lived along these rivers, farming wheat and barley, trading goods as far as the Persian Gulf. Let's start with the physical evidence archaeologists uncovered, because the scale of Harappan engineering is part of why this civilization's disappearance became such an enduring mystery. Excavations at sites like Mohenjo-Daro revealed multi-story brick houses, public wells positioned every few blocks, and covered sewage channels running beneath nearly every street. Granaries were built to store surplus grain for entire cities. Seals carved with animals and undeciphered script have been found as far away as Mesopotamia, proving these cities were not isolated. They were trading partners with some of the other great civilizations of the ancient world. And yet, for a civilization this advanced, no palaces have ever been found, no grand tombs for kings, no obvious evidence of a ruling dynasty at all. This has led some researchers to believe the Indus Valley Civilization may have been organized very differently from Egypt or Mesopotamia, perhaps governed by councils of merchants and priests rather than a single monarch. It is one more mystery layered on top of the genetic one, and it means that whoever inherited this civilization's DNA also inherited a culture that, in some ways, remains harder to reconstruct than its bones. Then, around 1900 BCE, it began to collapse. Cities were abandoned. Trade routes went silent. For a long time, historians did not agree on why. Some blamed invasion, some blamed climate change, some blamed shifting river paths that dried up the water supply cities depended on. When the collapse came, it did not happen everywhere at once. Some cities in the eastern part of the civilization's territory, closer to what is now Haryana and parts of Punjab, persisted longer than the great western cities like Mohenjo-Daro. Populations appear to have gradually shifted eastward and southward, away from rivers that were drying up and into smaller agricultural settlements. This slow, staggered decline is part of why scientists long debated whether the population truly vanished or whether it simply dispersed and blended into later communities, carrying its DNA forward even as its cities crumbled. But here is the question that mattered more than the collapse itself. What happened to the people? Did the population of the Indus Valley simply vanish? Or did they become the ancestors of the people who live in this region today, including the Punjabi people? For decades, scientists could not answer that question because ancient DNA does not survive well in hot, humid climates. Bones from Egypt and Europe held onto genetic material for thousands of years. Bones from South Asia usually did not. Every attempt to extract usable DNA from Indus Valley skeletons failed, until 2019. That year, a team of researchers finally succeeded in sequencing DNA from a skeleton buried in Rakhigarhi, one of the largest cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, located in what is now Haryana, not far from the Punjab region. It was the single most anticipated ancient DNA result in the history of South Asian archaeology. And what they found did not just answer old questions, it opened up new ones. The Rakhigarhi genome revealed something scientists had not fully expected. The people of the Indus Valley Civilization were not simply an offshoot of Central Asian populations, and they were not a direct match for populations from the Middle East either. Instead, their DNA represented an ancient South Asian lineage that had been developing largely on its own for thousands of years before the civilization even began. This is exactly what the Rakhigarhi genome helped settle. Because that individual buried in Rakhigarhi lived right at the tail end of this transition, and their DNA gave scientists a direct genetic snapshot of the Indus Valley population before later migrations arrived and mixed in. Comparing that ancient genome to the DNA of modern South Asians, including modern Punjabi populations, allowed researchers to calculate exactly how much of that ancient Indus Valley ancestry survives today. The answer, across most South Asian populations, is a significant and unmistakable percentage. Proof that this civilization's people did not vanish. Their descendants are alive today, and their DNA is still being studied. It is worth pausing here to explain what ancient DNA analysis actually involves, because it is far more complicated than simply swabbing a bone. Researchers have to drill into the densest part of a skeleton, usually the petrous bone located near the inner ear, because that bone preserves genetic material far better than any other part of the skeleton. The extracted material is often heavily contaminated with bacteria and modern human DNA from centuries of handling, so labs work in sterile, clean rooms, specifically designed to avoid contamination, similar to the precautions used in a hospital operating theater. Even with all of that care, hot and humid climates like South Asia degrade DNA so quickly that most attempts before 2019 produced unusable results. The successful sequencing of the Rakhigarhi genome was, in many ways, a triumph of laboratory technique as much as it was a historical discovery. This is also exactly why consumer DNA testing has become so popular across South Asia in recent years. When someone in Punjab today sends off a saliva sample to a genetic testing company, the report they get back is not pulling numbers out of thin air. It is being compared against exactly this kind of reference data, the ancient genomes from Rakhigarhi, the steppe migration samples analyzed in the Narasimhan study, and thousands of modern South Asian genomes collected from populations across the region. The percentages that show up on a typical ancestry report, categories like South Asian, Central Asian, or West Asian, are really just simplified summaries of the same ANI and ASI layers we have been discussing this entire video, translated into a format that is easier for a general audience to read. Scientists are still refining these reference panels every year, which is part of why ancestry estimates can shift slightly over time as new ancient samples get added to the comparison pool. For a region as historically layered as Punjab, that also means these reports are likely to keep getting more precise and more interesting in the years ahead. This ancestry has a name in genetics, Ancestral South Indian, or ASI for short, though that name is a little misleading because this lineage was not limited to the South. It was present all across South Asia, deeply rooted, going back tens of thousands of years to some of the earliest human populations that ever settled the Indian subcontinent after migrating out of Africa. The Rakhigarhi individual also carried a smaller, but very real, genetic connection to ancient Iranian farmers, people who, thousands of years earlier, had brought early farming techniques eastward from the region of the Zagros Mountains. This blend, deep South Asian ancestry mixed with a trace of ancient Iranian farmer ancestry, became known as the Indus Periphery population, essentially the genetic signature of the people who built and lived in the great cities of the Indus Valley. Now here is where it gets important for understanding Punjab specifically. When the Indus Valley Civilization collapsed, its population did not disappear. Genetic evidence shows this ancestry persisted. It spread outward. It became one of the two foundational genetic layers underlying almost every population in modern South Asia, including the people who would, thousands of years later, become known as Punjabi, but it is only half the story. Because around the same time the Indus cities were falling into decline, something else was happening thousands of kilometers to the north, something that would eventually collide with this ancient population and permanently change its genetic future. Here's where the story gets controversial, because what happened next has been debated, politicized, and misrepresented for over a century, and the real answer, according to the DNA, surprised almost everyone. For over 100 years, there has been a theory floating around called the Aryan migration, sometimes distorted into the far more extreme Aryan invasion theory. The basic idea, a group of people from Central Asia, speaking an early Indo-European language, migrated into South Asia sometime after the Indus Valley Civilization declined, and their arrival reshaped the region's language, culture, and, some claimed, its entire population. For decades, this theory was treated as either obvious fact or complete myth, depending on who you asked, because there simply was not hard genetic evidence either way. That changed with a landmark study published in the journal Science in 2019, led by geneticist Vagish Narasimhan and a team of over 100 international researchers, analyzing ancient DNA from more than 500 individuals across Central and South Asia. The results were unambiguous. Starting around 2000 to 1500 BCE, right around the time the Indus Valley cities were emptying out, a new genetic component appears in the region. It is called steppe ancestry, tracing back to pastoralist populations from the Eurasian Steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine through Kazakhstan. These were people who had already mixed with other Central Asian groups on their way south, herding cattle, riding horses, and speaking an early form of the language family that would eventually branch into Sanskrit, Persian, Latin, Greek, and much later, Punjabi itself. This was not a single dramatic invasion with armies and conquest, the way older textbooks sometimes described it. The genetic data suggests something slower and more complicated. Successive waves of migration and mixing over centuries, not a single event. But the outcome was still massive. By the time you reach populations in northern South Asia today, including Punjab, this steppe ancestry makes up a meaningful percentage of the genome, layered directly on top of that older Indus Valley population. Now let's return to the steppe migration, because there's more to this story than a single wave of arrivals. Genetic and archaeological evidence together suggest the migration happened in stages, spread out over several centuries. The earliest steppe-related ancestry appears to arrive through populations associated with cultures like the Sintashta, located in what is now southern Russia and Kazakhstan, known for early use of horse-drawn chariots and advanced bronze metallurgy. These populations moved south through Central Asia over generations, mixing with local populations along the way, before eventually reaching the northwestern edge of South Asia. This matters because it explains why steppe ancestry in South Asia today is not identical to steppe ancestry found in ancient skeletons from the Russian steppe itself. It had already been diluted and mixed by the time it arrived, layer after layer, population after population, each contributing a slightly different genetic signature. By the time this ancestry reaches Punjab, it carries the fingerprints of an extraordinarily long journey, stretching across thousands of kilometers and hundreds, if not thousands of years. There is also a cultural signature that traveled alongside this genetic one, and it might be the most consequential part of the entire story. The language family carried by these steppe-descended populations belongs to what linguists call Indo-European, the same family that eventually produced Sanskrit. And through Sanskrit, many of the modern languages spoken across northern South Asia today, including Punjabi itself. This is why Punjabi shares deep grammatical roots with languages as far away as Persian, Russian, and even English, all distant cousins, branching from the same ancient linguistic tree that steppe migrants carried with them into South Asia thousands of years ago. Geneticists have also used a specific genetic marker to trace this migration with remarkable precision, a Y chromosome lineage called R1a. This marker, passed down from father to son, almost unchanged for thousands of years, is found at strikingly high frequencies in populations across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Northern South Asia, including in a significant proportion of Punjabi men tested in modern studies. Its distribution closely mirrors the path scientists believe the steppe migration took, offering yet another independent line of evidence that lines up almost perfectly with the ancient DNA findings from whole genome studies. And this is where the true genetic identity of the Punjabi people starts to take shape. Not one ancestry, not two separate peoples who stayed apart. A blend, the deep-rooted ASI and Indus periphery ancestry, from the civilization that built the cities along the rivers, mixed with the incoming steppe ancestry that arrived in the centuries after those cities fell silent. Geneticists gave this blended ancestry two more names you will often see in research papers: Ancestral North Indian, or ANI, referring to populations with a higher proportion of steppe and West Eurasian-related ancestry, and Ancestral South Indian, or ASI, referring to populations with a higher proportion of that original Indus-era lineage. Virtually no population in South Asia today is purely one or the other. Every group sits somewhere on a gradient between them, and Punjab sits in a very specific place on that gradient, a place that turns out to be one of the most genetically distinct regions in the entire subcontinent. But there is one more piece to this puzzle, a piece that has nothing to do with ancient migrations, and everything to do with something much more recent, something that happened only a few hundred years ago and still shows up clearly in Punjabi DNA today. Now let's talk about caste, because no honest discussion of South Asian genetics can avoid this topic, and Punjab is no exception. A landmark 2009 study led by geneticists David Reich and Kumarasamy Thangaraj, published in the journal Nature, analyzed genetic data from dozens of populations across the subcontinent and found something remarkable. Populations that had practiced strict endogamy, marrying only within their own community for many generations, often going back over 1,000 years, showed clear signs of what geneticists call a genetic bottleneck. Their overall genetic diversity narrowed over time, sometimes to a degree comparable to isolated island populations. Punjab's history looks different from many of these isolated groups, as a corridor region rather than an isolated one. Many communities within Punjab, though certainly practicing their own social and marriage customs, existed within a broader environment of continuous contact, trade, and periodic migration. This does not mean every Punjabi community has identical ancestry. It means that, compared to some of the most genetically isolated populations elsewhere in South Asia, Punjab as a region shows a wider genetic range, shaped by centuries of continuous contact with outside populations. If you compare the genome of a Punjabi individual to the genome of someone from, say, Tamil Nadu in the far south, or Bengal in the east, you will find that gradient we just talked about. Punjab consistently shows one of the highest proportions of ANI, or Steppe-related, ancestry of any region in South Asia. This lines up with its geography. Punjab sits in the northwest, directly along the historical migration corridor that steppe populations, and later other Central Asian and West Asian groups, used to enter the subcontinent for thousands of years. But there is something else researchers found when they looked closer at populations, specifically from Punjab, both on the Pakistani and Indian sides of the modern border. Unlike some isolated populations elsewhere in South Asia, groups that, due to strict endogamy, or marrying only within their own community for thousands of years ended up with unusually narrow genetic diversity, Punjabi populations show a broader, more mixed genetic profile. This reflects the region's long history as a crossroads. Punjab was not a dead end. It was a corridor. Persians, Greeks under Alexander's successors, Central Asian Turkic groups, Afghans, and Mughal-era populations all passed through, settled, and left genetic traces layered on top of that ancient ANI-ASI foundation. This is actually the answer to a question that has confused people for a long time. Why do Punjabis often show noticeable genetic and even physical variation across different communities? Some populations with a higher West Eurasian genetic signature, others closer to the broader South Asian average. It is not because one group is purer or more ancient than another, a claim that has been misused historically for social and political purposes. It is because Punjab absorbed genetic contributions from multiple migrations over thousands of years, and how much of each layer a specific community carries depends on the complex, localized history of marriage patterns and social structure in that specific group, not on some single clean bloodline. Modern genetic studies on present-day Punjabi populations, including research published in respected genetics journals, consistently place Punjabi genetic ancestry in a cluster with other northwestern South Asian groups, showing closer genetic affinity to populations in Pakistan's Sindh and Balochistan regions, and to populations in Afghanistan and Iran, than to populations in southern or eastern India. At the same time, that deep ASI layer, the DNA connecting all the way back to the Indus Valley Civilization and even earlier populations, never disappeared. It is still there, in every Punjabi genome tested, as the oldest layer beneath everything else. Let's talk about what happened after the ancient migrations, because Punjabi DNA was not frozen in time after the steppe ancestry arrived. Empire after empire moved through this exact region over the following centuries. The Achaemenid Persian Empire controlled parts of the northwest around the 5th century BCE. Alexander the Great's armies crossed into Punjab in 326 BCE, and though his conquest was brief, some of his soldiers and administrators settled in the region afterward, leaving behind small but detectable genetic traces still occasionally identified in modern studies. Centuries later, Central Asian Turkic and Persian-influenced dynasties, followed by the Mughal Empire, brought further waves of migration, trade, and intermarriage through the same corridor. Each of these historical episodes left a faint genetic signature, layered on top of the deeper ancient foundation. None of them replaced what came before. They added to it, the same way sediment layers build up over time in a riverbed, each one telling part of the story, none of them erasing the layers beneath. This layered picture is why modern genetic studies describe Punjabi ancestry, not as a single clean category, but as what researchers sometimes call a genetic cline, a gradual continuous gradient of ancestry proportions that shifts as you move across the region and across different communities within it. Some individuals carry a higher proportion of that ancient Indus Valley and deep South Asian ancestry. Others carry a higher proportion of steppe-related ancestry. Most fall somewhere comfortably in between, carrying the genetic evidence of thousands of years of contact rather than isolation. So when you ask, where does Punjabi DNA really come from? The honest, scientifically accurate answer is not a single place or single people. It is layers, a foundation stretching back over 10,000 years to the earliest population of South Asia. A civilization-era layer connected to the builders of the Indus Valley cities. A steppe ancestry layer that arrived in waves starting around 2000 BCE, bringing the language family that would eventually become Punjabi itself. and more recent contributions from the many groups who use this region as a corridor between Central Asia, Persia, and the rest of South Asia, right up through the last 1,000 years. That is not a weakness in the story. It is actually the opposite. It means Punjabi identity, at the genetic level, is one of the most layered and historically rich ancestries anywhere in the world, a living record of nearly every major migration that shaped South Asia. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we bring this story together, and it involves a question many viewers ask whenever a video like this comes out. If Punjabi ancestry is this layered, this mixed, this shaped by thousands of years of contact, does that mean the idea of a distinct Punjabi identity is somehow less real? Geneticists who study this exact question generally give the same answer, and it might surprise you. Genetic ancestry and cultural identity are not the same thing, and they were never meant to be measured with the same ruler. A population's genetic history tells you where the DNA in their bodies traveled from over thousands of years. It does not tell you about language, food, music, land, family structure, or the countless generations of lived experience that actually shape what it means to belong to a specific community today. Punjabi identity, in the modern sense, is built on language, on shared land along the rivers of the Punjab region, on centuries of shared history, culture, and tradition, not on some mythical, unmixed bloodline that never existed in the first place, not in Punjab, and not anywhere else in the world. Every population on Earth, if you trace its DNA back far enough, turns out to be a story of migration and mixing. Punjab's story is simply better documented than most because it sits on one of the most heavily studied migration corridors on the entire planet. This is actually one of the most consistent findings across all of modern population genetics, not just in South Asia, but everywhere ancient DNA has been studied, from Europe to East Asia to the Americas. The idea of a population that stayed genetically untouched for thousands of years almost never holds up once scientists actually test the DNA. Populations migrate, populations mix, populations absorb their neighbors and get absorbed in turn. Punjab is not an exception to this rule. It might be one of its clearest examples, precisely because its location made it a crossroads for nearly every major movement of people across Eurasia over the last 5,000 years. Researchers studying this region continue to refine the picture every single year. New ancient genomes are still being sequenced from sites across Pakistan, India, and Central Asia, and each new sample adds a little more precision to the timeline we have just walked through. Some open questions remain, including exactly how many distinct waves of steppe migration reached South Asia, and how the proportions shifted differently across different communities within Punjab itself over the centuries that followed. What is no longer in question is the basic outline. An ancient South Asian population, connected to one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, formed the deep foundation. A wave of steppe-descended migrants arrived over the following centuries, bringing new ancestry and a new language family with them. And centuries of additional contact through trade, conquest, and settlement added further layers on top, right up through the last 1,000 years of recorded history. So let us go back to the question we opened with. For 1,000 years, the story of Punjabi origins was told as something simple: one bloodline, one migration, one clean answer. The DNA tells a completely different story. It tells us that the people of Punjab carry the genetic memory of one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world, mixed with the DNA of pastoralist migrants who crossed thousands of kilometers from the Eurasian Steppe, layered again with the traces of every empire and group that passed through this corridor for the next 4,000 years. It took scientists 1,000 years of historical debate and less than a decade of ancient DNA breakthroughs to finally put the pieces together. The Rakhigarhi genome in 2019, the massive steppe migration study the same year, dozens of modern population studies since then, each confirming the same layered picture. And the most remarkable part of this story is not just what it tells us about the past, it is what it tells us about identity itself. That even a population as specific and rooted as Punjabi is, genetically speaking, is a story of connection, not isolation. Every Punjabi genome carries pieces of a much bigger human story, one that stretches from the earliest settlers of South Asia to the horse-riding pastoralists of the steppe, to the empires that rose and fell along the Indus for thousands of years. If this video helped you understand where Punjabi ancestry really comes from, make sure to subscribe, because next week we are breaking down the DNA mystery of another population whose real origin story has never been fully told. And the results might surprise you even more than this one did. And if you have Punjabi ancestry or family roots anywhere near the Indus River region, I want to know, drop a comment and tell us what you already knew about your family's history, and what part of this video was completely new to you. Scientists are still uncovering new ancient DNA every year, and the next big discovery about this region could be just around the corner. Thanks so much for watching this all the way through, and I will see you in the next video very soon.